questions and then answer them. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Okay. The first one is always a real beaut. So, how does a wife help her husband realize he's being effeminate, and how can she help him overcome this? Okay. There's two parts to it. The first is have him listen to my conference on how to raise a man. Because in there I talk about what effeminacy actually is, right? If you can get him to listen to it. I've actually given that conference to guys that fight in the MMA. And they all admit there's some area of their life that even they're effeminate. So we all have it. It's part of the curse of Adam. We're all stuck with it. The question is what form is it going to take and what are we going to do about overcoming it? So how can you help him overcome it? I think just doing that, but helping him to realize that part of it is just being responsible and being willing to, putting aside his pleasure and being willing to engage in things that are painful. If he does that on a consistent basis, he'll overcome it. The other side, and you have to get the grace for him, right? So you have to pray that he receives the grace to see that what he's being, and that he needs to be willing to overcome it. Because without the grace, you might see it, but it's like, so what? A lot of guys today, too, one of the phenomenon that's a little scary is, and not that I mean to beat up on them, they're just easy targets, as I always say, is the millennials. The millennial men seem happy in their effeminacy, right? They like it. They kind of glory in it. I'm just sitting here. My wife's doing everything, you know. And even the appeal to normal men, when you just tell them, you know, you're not a man if you're doing that. It hurts interiorly, but them is like, okay, you know. So there's no. But the point is, you're going to need grace for them to see this is a problem and that they actually need to address it. The second way you're going to help him is he will never start sacrificing for you, and he will never be responsible in relationship to you if at any time you try to control him. He'll just check out. So one of the principal ways that you can help him overcome his effeminacy is by conquering the curse of Eve, which is the desire to control, right? And so that's one of the principal ways that you can do it. Okay. If you want to know more about that, just pray that I have time to write the book I'm compiling right now. Okay. Is streaming, not owning, a Disney movie ever okay? This person's obviously not a Disney fan, it says. Just sometimes I find a movie and it turns out it's Disney. That is, for example, Old Yeller. Okay, there is a distinction that has to be made between the artist and the art. So, provided that the art is such that it is not tainted by the, and by tainted I mean in the sense that, you know, everybody who watches this movie knows that it came from this guy and they're supporting him by watching it. So, that's what I'm talking about. As long as it's not in that mode, and as long as the movie itself does not contain anything that cannot be simulated, so you can listen to that conference that I have online, that is, that it's integrally good, the movie's okay morally, then there's no reason that you can't watch it. So there's a distinction between, it's not sinful to watch these movies, although the more perfect virtue would probably be to not watch them, just for the sake of developing virtue and basically telling Disney we're not going to tolerate what you're doing now. Okay. So, what resources do you recommend we use to study the natural law? That one's pretty rough because all the stuff about the natural law, well, there's a few things. I mean, if you just study documents like by Pius XII in relationship to things like, or Pius XI, sorry, and Pius XII in relationship to the conjugal act and things like that, and Humanae Vitae has a lot of the stuff that's because it's firmly rested in the natural law. Veritatis Splendor of John Paul II is also rooted in the natural law. It'll give you a sense of that. Donum Vitae also is a document that helps you start to get a sense of the application and how the natural law functions. But if you actually really want to look at the natural law, I do have a section in my book. It's not easy read, but you can do it. Or you can read the Summa, question 94 in the Prima Secundae is where St. Thomas talks about it. And as John Paul II said, that St. Thomas's teaching of the natural law, the church takes into its own. So it's the foundation for the church's understanding of the natural law is the Thomistic one. So that would be where I would start. There are some books that have been put out about the natural law, but they, it's one of those things that I'm reluctant to recommend them because there's usually some stuff that's a little off. In other words, they don't follow the Thomistic and the church's understanding of the natural law quite closely enough. And so, and I know there's been some stuff that's been put out recently, I just haven't had a chance to review it, but that's where I would start. Is it morally illicit to invest in 401ks or Roth IRAs? It just depends on what they're investing in, right? So if the people that are doing the investing for that, because when you put it in, like a 401k, it's usually someone else is determining where that money goes. And a lot of times you can just ask, where's my money going? And if it's not, then don't do it. There are companies, I can't remember their names right off the bat, but there's like 2 or 3 different companies out there that are actually Catholic that invest only in companies that are morally upright. Well, yeah, there's that. Knights of Columbus.
They have their own fund.
Yeah, so there's them. I think it's also called the Aquinas Fund, does. They do it. There's one other one I just came across recently. What's that? That's it, yeah. So there's other ones that you do it. So usually what I just tell people is get all your money out of there and put it there, and they supposedly they do pretty good on their investments. Okay. Does adoration increase your love of God for his sake alone? Yes, if it's done properly. In other words, if you're doing it because you want to show him that you love him. Do we have any insight this happening? How can you tell? Does it show up as increase in charity? That's a really good question. So basically, how do you know you're starting to love God for his sake? Well, here's the thing. The way the infused virtues work, which includes the infused moral virtues, like infused prudence, which deals with things that are necessary to do the right things for your salvation, or infused temperance, which basically is done fasting to subdue our faculties, to give glory to God, etc., to be more incongruent with him, which is different from the natural virtues. But then also the infused virtues are the theological virtues. The way these work is we are not their cause, as I mentioned. Because we're not their cause and God is their cause, what we do does not cause their increase in us. So even if we have charity, if I perform an act of charity, that act does not directly cause an increase in charity, which is different from natural or acquired virtue. So like if I diet, which, in order to, I say I just want greater control over my eating habits in this area, and I diet, my saying no to myself directly contributes to that virtue. It actually causes that virtue to be built. Whereas in the infused virtue side, that's not the case. So when I perform the action, St. Thomas says it creates a disposition in my faculty for an increase in that, and then subsequently to that, or as a result of that, God infuses more of that virtue in me, and that means that our experience of it as we perform the action, it doesn't feel like we have any virtue or that we have a certain amount. And then what we'll notice is then God infuses it. We don't necessarily know that we don't experience the actual infusion. We just happen to notice later that I'm being more charitable. I'm actually being kinder. I'm doing these things. So it's subsequent to that, we notice the effect of that virtue is more present. And so you just keep building it, and then you'll start to realize, I am loving God, I want to love God, etc., for his own sake. One of the things that can happen, though, is that a lot of times our motivations, we can think, I'm loving God for his own sake, when actually we're not. Right? So you have to ask God to purify your motives and actually give you the grace to see whether you are doing it for love of him. This is in regarding the problem of cursed objects. How does a cursed object transfer, I'm not sure what that is, to an innocent person who touches it? How would they know? Well, okay. I recently heard that cursed money, like stacks and pennies being left outside, on steps of schools, nearby schools, if you aren't in the state of grace, that can affect you. That's actually, we caught wind of that too. They're actually cursing objects like money and sticking it out there, hoping that people will get affected by it. So here's the moral to the story. Okay. First of all, if you're praying for your protection, your odds of getting affected by that stuff are practically nil. This is one of the reasons why every time I open my own personal mail, I actually ask our Lord and Our Lady to protect me from anybody who tried to curse me, because who knows what people are sending me. You know, if some white powder shows up, I have to take a look, right? Okay. And this is one of the reasons why we just tell people, look, if you send us a package unsolicited, we're just going to send it back, because we just don't. It's just a matter of protection, but part of it is people would just send us stuff, and then it would create this, like, just one person sent me a package recently. By the time it was done, I had 3 hours into that package, and I don't have 3 hours of time to put into somebody's package, right? So that being said, not that what they were asking for was necessarily not legitimate. It's just that I just can't fulfill that request. So here's the moral to the story. If you're in the state of grace, the real issue about curses is not so much the curse, the efficacy of the curse. The real question is, what open door do you have on your side that allows the curse to have its effect? That's the real issue. So if you're living in the state of grace consistently and saying your prayers and asking God for protection, your odds of getting influenced by these objects is practically nil. It's only if you're not living in the state of grace and you're in a state of mortal sin, or if there's some other thing which you have some other type of psychological compatibility with the diabolic. For example, you hate somebody or something like that. That can be the open door in which people get in. Now, I should say, not being negligent in saying prayers of protection itself can be an open door, because it's a form of negligence and we have to take reasonable care to protect ourselves. So I'll give you an example. One time, one of the exorcists that trained me asked me, hey, would you go talk to this woman? You might have heard me tell this story. She says, hey, would you talk to this woman? I can't get to her, but I think she's possessed. And so I go in and I talk to her, and I had forgotten when I went in to say prayers of protection. So I go in, I'm talking to her. Sounds like possession, looks like possession, but she likes the possession. She likes what she's getting from this. So I told her, okay, look, once you're willing to cut bait with this guy, let me know and I'll help you. But in the meantime, I can't do anything. Well, I leave, and the next day I come down with the worst case of gout I've ever had in my life, right? And so usually I just cut out Darien, and boom, it goes away right away. Well, this week later, I'm still dealing with this thing, and then it dawns on me. It shows you how slow I am sometimes. I'm like, I wonder if she didn't curse me. So I did the exorcism of apostate angels, which is the one that Leo XIII wrote, over myself, and boom, it cleared right up. I'm like, what do you know? So I called the guy. Oh, and in the meantime, so I called the guy that's the priest that is a friend of mine. And I said, to tell him, hey, you might watch, get cursed. Well, I can't get a hold of him. 2 weeks later, he calls, I would have called you, but I came down with the worst case of gout I've ever had in my life. I said, let me guess, your right foot, big toe. Yeah, how did you know? I'm like, dude, you were cursed. So he did chapter 3, and it clears up. Well, a year later, the woman, my point being is, if you don't if you're not consistent and be disciplined in this stuff, you can get taken to the woodshed, right? So a year later, another priest says, well, I think she's changed. Maybe you can talk to her again. So this time I went in, said a prayer to St. Michael, if I remember right, but then also said to our Lord, look, if she tries to curse me, Jesus, if it's your holy will, I ask you to send it back from whence it came, but in either case, keep me protected. So I go in, talk to her. Sure enough, she still wants the occult information that these demons are telling her, and so she doesn't want to, and I just gave her the same line. Well, if you want to cut bait with this guy, I'll be happy to help you. So I leave. A week later, I called the priest that asked me to go talk to her, and I said, well, how's she doing? She said, right after you left, she ended up in the hospital. So the moral of the story is, the real question is the open door on your side. So as long as you're staying in the state of grace, receiving the sacraments, getting to confession, and making sure there's nothing in your life that makes you compatible with diabolic behavior, and also you're saying prayers of protection, you're not going to get influenced. So that's the real issue. Should we practice the holy face of Jesus' devotion to combat communism? If we had enough people doing it, then would this change our country's direction? Yeah, but it would have to be pretty significant. Obviously, the Holy Face devotion was specifically engendered precisely to combat communism, and that's why it's so effective. I do have a case I'm working on right now where the people are using the Holy Face to combat the diabolic influence, and is extraordinarily effective. So as a devotion, I can't recommend it enough. As far as communism go, I'm not sure at this point we'd be able to fully weed it out unless, the bishops, we can laugh now, but if the bishops would actually get on board and say, hey, this is what we should do, right? I just don't see it happening. Not that devotion couldn't do that. I'm just saying that I don't see us as people doing it enough to do it, to get it done. Aren't we in the chastisement now starting to accelerate? By the chastisement, I think it's generally understood the physical side, where obviously in the spiritual side it's already begun. In the sense, I think that's right, it's accelerating. But there's always the spiritual precursor, which we are obviously in. Things are starting to implode, as we see within the church. But that's going to lead, that's the precursor that's going to lead to the other things. The other thing is watch for if something really significant happens in the life of the church that causes a retraction of the grace to the rest of the world, because all grace comes into the world by means of the Catholic Church. So if something happens, like, I'm not going to tell you what it is because I think I already know what it is, but when that thing happens, you're going to see very shortly a concomitant, complete disintegration in the geopolitical side of things, and it's going to go really downhill. How much should we obey the government? Well, it's in all areas that they have legitimate authority. So, like, obviously you obey the speed limit because they have the right to set that, right? On the other hand, I always tell people, the government, Christ said, render to Caesar what's Caesar. So we do have an obligation to pay our taxes. The problem is that Caesar, God only wants 10%. Where did the government ever get off that it's entitled to more than 10%? They're not God. You're not entitled to more. And that's of all forms of tax. That's if you add up your property tax, your sales tax, your car tax, your income tax, all forms of tax in total cannot exceed 10%, because once the government does, it's unjust. So do I have an obligation to pay taxes? Yeah, but you have an obligation to get it down as low as you possibly can, especially how evil they are. Okay. So what do you do when the priests, clergy, follow left leanings of the Democratic Party? Pray and do penance, ultimately, because that's the only thing that's going to change them. We get the leaders we deserve, and that even includes the clergy. Oh, here's one. This one always gets people riled up. Okay. Expand on praying with non-Catholics. If we don't pray with them, how can we convert them? Okay. So here is why praying with non-Catholics historically was considered mortally sinful. We're not talking about just a little thing. The church considered it grave matter. And as I mentioned, you can actually read, you can go online, it's at the Latin Mass magazine's website. There's an article by a guy named Craig Allen, and in that article he talks about and shows with citations everywhere where the church has said you are absolutely forbidden to do this, right? Okay. So, and here's the reason why. When Christ came and established the church and gave the elements of sanctification, he gave them specifically to the apostles and their successors, so that only those in union with those apostles and successors can make legitimate use of them, because if they don't, if they use those elements of sanctification outside of the apostles and their successors, they commit a sin of injustice against the apostles or their successors, whose rights it is to be the custodians of those elements of sanctification. What's that mean? If you're not in the church, any religious thing that you do, like baptize somebody, or is actually offensive to God, because it's contrary to the fact that it was supposed to be done in union with those who have the rights over those elements of sanctification. The bishops basically have a right to make determinations of when the sacraments are applied, and etc. And this includes praying over people and praying with people, etc. Okay, so anytime somebody ostensibly, now here we cannot, people say, well, subjectively people may not fully realize that they're cut off from the church. Okay, that's fine, but we can't go on people's subjective states. We have to go on objectively what we're saying. Now, if someone is objectively staying outside the Catholic Church, that means that they are essentially, ostensibly, we don't know internally. We're not supposed to judge that. Our judge is to base it on objectively, this person is remaining outside the Catholic Church, and therefore, by refusing to come into the Catholic Church, that is displeasing to God. And so when we join our prayers to theirs, who are outside the church and ostensibly remaining outside the church, we are joining our prayers to somebody who is basically, whose prayers himself, actually, by praying and intentionally staying outside the church, or even just ostensibly staying outside the church, that is displeasing to God. So it's analogous to this. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I had a really nice car, and it's sitting in my driveway, and I go inside, and I come out, and I look at the car's gone. Or at least the wheels are gone. But I look over, and across the street, my neighbor has taken my car and driven it over there, and then says, "Hey, Father Ripperger, what do you think of my car? Don't you love my car?" It ain't his car. It's my car. He's stolen the thing. And this is exactly what happens when Protestants and non-Catholics take things from the church and use them outside the church. That's what's happening. And so every time we join our prayers to theirs, it's the technical part. It's called quibus auxiliis, but not that that means much. It's a part of the. It's a circumstance in which you're joining yourself to somebody whose prayers are displeasing to God because of the fact that they're remaining outside the church. This was something that even the Protestants knew. You don't pray with Catholics. Protestants didn't even pray with each other if they were of different denominations, right? And so this is one of the reasons why it was considered absolutely forbidden. And so you can read that article. It's actually really good. It gets into the actual applications. So how can we convert them? You pray for them, not with them. The other thing is about converting people. There's a very good trick that you can use. To convert somebody, there's a positive and a negative. The positive side is that you have to get the grace for their conversions. You have to pray for them. You can talk to them about the faith, etc. You can pray independently of them, etc. But you can't pray with them. The second part of it is, and by the way, if you pray with them, one of the psychological dynamics you're going to be dealing with is the fact that in their mind, you could be confirming them that it's okay that they remain in their order because you're praying with them. So you have to be careful with that. But so there's the positive. You have to pray to get them the grace of conversion. But the other side of it is that because grace enlightens the mind and strengthens the will, the demons have access to the emotions, which are down below. So even if God gives a person a grace on the higher faculties, the demons can move the lower faculties through fear or through other things to avert the person from, well, I know I should convert to faith, but if I do, what's going to happen to my family, etc. So they can derail the person's accepting of the grace. And so you have to start asking our Lord and Our Lady to remove any demons that are blocking them from coming into the church. And if you do that consistently and win in the grace, slowly it will happen. Okay. Why is the Eucharist referred to as the bread of angels, assuming angels cannot receive the Eucharist since they don't have bodies? Well, it's an analogy in the sense that the bread of angels refers to the fact that it's God and the angels who are in heaven have the beatific vision. And so through the beatific vision, they receive all the knowledge and delight and everything. So it's kind of like this quasi-nourishment in an analogical sense that they receive from God by that beatific vision. And so the fact that the bread of the Eucharist is God, in that sense, it's the bread of angels in the sense of it's a reference to the angels. It's also just a general reference to the angels get to participate and see, but be in heaven. And so with us, we get to partake of something that's in heaven, that is God, and Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity that is in heaven. We get to participate in those by that. So that's where the angels are at, because the angels are in heaven. Okay. There's all sorts of different levels to that. How do you suggest we prepare for limited access to the sacraments? Do I really have to go without Holy Communion again? Well, it's not a matter of do you have to, it's you may not be able to go to communion, right? So how do you prepare for this? It basically means that you have to get to the point where your prayer life and everything is such. Now, the ordinary means of our sanctification are the sacraments, and that's what God intended. But he's willing to let that ordinary providence be retracted so that people become more dependent upon him and also see the value of them, and also that we stop offending him through this process. So that being said, the way that you prepare yourself is by getting to the point where you're not falling into mortal sin, you're rooting out all venial sin in your life. That means that you're not that you should stop going to confession. You should continue going to confession, even if you get to the point where you're only committing venial sin. You should continue going to confession. But if you're getting to the point where you're only venial sinning once in a while, or not venial sinning at all, which, by the way, is attainable, then you won't. The necessity for the confession won't be as urgent, right? And it's also going to just be a suffering that people go through. Historically, there have been places where people have got to go through this, but we have to be willing to suffer it so that we can merit its return. I'm watching interviews with survivors of the Andes plane crash in the 1970s. They survived by eating the dead, even rationalizing that it was like Holy Communion eating Jesus' body. Yeah, that's a little weird. Okay. I'm really not sure what to think. They survived 72 days in the mountains. What do you say? Well, I'll tell you what the moralists say. How about that? Because what I think is irrelevant. Okay. There are 3 different kinds of moral acts. I have to go into this to give you an adequate answer. The first is what we call an act that it's a moral act. The moral species of the act, which means what kind of act it is determined by 2 things: the nature of the act itself, and then what's called the conditions, not circumstances, the conditions. So, for example, if you see someone on the streets of New York taking the purse, that's the natural act, taking a purse from an elderly white woman, right? Taking the purse. What is that morally? You don't know that. How do you know it's not his purse, especially today? Some of these 80-year-old women are pretty cantankerous. Maybe it was a Gucci purse, and she's like, I want that purse, right? What does that mean? You have to know the condition of the purse in relationship to the action to know whether this is theft or rightly restoring of the property, right? Okay. So there's those kinds of actions. Then there's actions that are called a conditionalist species. All you have to do is see the natural act, and from that you can derive what's happening morally. Certain forms of suicide. So some guy takes a gun, sticks it up to his head, and pulls a trigger, right? That, you don't need any more to know that that was an act of suicide. On the other hand, when people were jumping off the Twin Towers, that may not have been suicide, because some people do survive falls, and so it might have been a desperate act of survival, right? Okay. So, and the one that I usually give, which is very, very clear, is sodomy. You don't need to know anything other than what you see on a physicality of the act to know morally what's happening, right? Okay. But then there are certain kinds of acts that require a condition, and it takes a conditionalist species, and then you add another condition, and it changes it even more, right? Okay. But I want to go back to this one that you take the natural act, and then you take the condition, and put those 2 together, and that tells you what's happening morally. So I take the purse, it belongs to me, it's a rightful or restored property. If I don't, then it's not. Now, St. Thomas says that there are certain kinds of moral acts in which the natural species has an inchoate disorder about them. By inchoate, he means it's not its final moral species like it is with sodomy. It's rather, it's kind of got this natural disorder to it, but it's not necessarily a moral disorder. So, for example, he says killing a man is one of those things, right? And so, and by the way, these can be naturally good inchoately, and they can be naturally bad inchoately. So a naturally good inchoate act is the conjugal act, right? So, but in order to render the conjugal act licit, so the conjugal act, St. Thomas, the definition, the natural species is to know a woman. That's what the moralists say is the actual natural species. She has to be yours, which is marriage, in order for that condition of marriage to render that act naturally good. Now then, the natural act actually has an inchoate goodness. This is why people think it's okay, because they lose their, as we become more morally depraved, our ability to discern what's a condition and what's not a condition begins to break down, and so they think this is okay, right? But it actually needs this condition, because without this condition it becomes evil. Now, when you're talking about something that's inchoately bad, he gives the example of killing a man, right? He said, however, when it's coupled with a condition, what he calls a justifying condition, it actually renders the totality of the act actually good. So, for example, he said, if there's somebody in a legitimate act of self-defense, the guy's trying to kill him, and then he ends up killing the fact that he is acting as a agent of the state, and he's trying to defend himself, and this guy is trying to kill him, that renders that act of self-defense morally good. Or in the case of war, if it's a just war, the people on the side that are doing the justice, that when they kill somebody, because they're the status of both of them being combatants, when one kills the other one, it actually can be rendered morally good. Okay. So when you're talking about cannibalism is eating human flesh in which there is no justifying condition. So what happens is, if you have the justifying condition, which is you're going to starve and die, all the moralists say that justifying condition in eating this renders it not an act of cannibalism, but a moral act of survival. If you don't have that justifying condition, then it becomes cannibalism, and it's gravely disordered. And so most moralists, when they look at that, they say, and obviously it has to be a last resort. Can't believe, hey, the plane just went down half an hour ago. Hey, Joe, those femurs are looking pretty good. It can't be that. It has to be a legitimate act of survival. Okay. A long explanation, but it's the only way to answer it. Okay. Nefarious, the movie, has been promoted by an exorcist priest quite publicly. No name needed. We all know who he is. Okay. Who would this movie be beneficial or unbeneficial to see? I think it'd be beneficial for most people. I have not seen it, only because I just simply haven't had time. The exorcists, the very knowledgeable and solid exorcists that I talked to, have said it's the best one they've seen so far. And they said it's actually very good. So in that regard, I think for most people it would be good. I think it would be something which I think people have to be in a certain place spiritually, though. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to have your kid who's like 10 watch it, because it could be traumatizing. But you want to, so in other words, it should be age appropriate to some degree. But then also there are certain people who they're just going to poo-poo it because they think it's ridiculous. On the other hand, the priests that I've talked to that have seen it have said that it's pretty hard not to get sucked into the logic of the dialogue. And so people who are watching it, even if you don't think there's demons, there's a certain element of the dialogue that rings home to people. And so they're like, maybe there is something that's actually there. I found out by reading on the internet that I was consulted for that movie. I don't even know who these guys are. So then one of the guys was doing an interview, and they said, "Oh, so you can." The interviewer was like, "Oh, so you consulted Father Ripperger?" He said, "No, we just watched all his videos." Okay, how do we know when God is giving us graces and what He wants us to do with them? Well, usually they incline you towards good acts, good supernatural acts. But you can come listen to Father McKelleron, because he's going to talk about that. Okay. What virtue does punctuality fall under? Technically, punctuality falls under fortitude as to its nature, but it can also fall under charity or justice. If we're consistently being late for stuff and we're annoying people, etc., then it can be contrary to charity. Okay. So sometimes the motivation for it is charity, but ultimately it's part of self-discipline, where you're just at the right place at the right time. May you please elaborate on Catholics praying with other people of different faiths? Well, okay, we dealt with that. Dealt with that. This is going pretty fast. Although we got quite the stack. Okay. Is it correct to refer to Protestants as Christians? Do we worship the same God as them? Okay. I'm going to give you a twofold answer. Colloquially, and even in the church, anybody who subscribes to the Trinity and the Incarnation is generally referred to as a Christian. Okay. Generally. However, if you're talking about following the religion that Christ himself established, technically speaking, they're not. That the term Christian would be synonymous with Catholic. But, obviously, we use that colloquially in different ways. Do we worship the same God as them? St. Thomas says in his Summa Theologiae, he says that a single deviation from an attribute of God in belief results in the person not worshiping the same God as we do. This means, basically what that means is, for example, even though it says it in Vatican II, not a solid theologian before Vatican II would have ever had said that the Muslims worship the same God that we do. In fact, St. Thomas very clearly shows how their deviation from understanding of God's mercy and how God works and the fact that God is triune, they don't believe that, and as a result, they do not worship the same God we do. What he says is they worship their own idea of God. A big difference. Now, this is not indicative just of the Muslims. This can also be true even of the Protestants if they do not, if they don't believe in certain attributes of God that the Catholics believe. But it's also true even of Catholics, right? There are certain Catholics, when you hear people say things like, well, I think God is so merciful that everyone's going to be saved. Well, God's also infinitely just. How's that work into the equation? And that's why I mentioned St. Thomas says that when people deviate from the Catholic understanding of God, what they end up doing is worshiping their own idea of him, their own opinion rather than him, right? This is a very important point because this is one of the reasons why God has to come down and reveal. Let's face it, human beings are dumb as a bag of hammers. And if you leave this area, which is particularly dicey and difficult to human beings, it's just going to end up stupid. And you see this by some of the liturgies. And this is one of the reasons why the church has to take away from the priests the control over the liturgies. Because you just get stupid liturgy because priests are stupid, right? And it's the same thing in relationship to us just as human beings. It's why we have to conform to what God reveals about himself, because we're just highly prone to error, especially in this area. Okay. What about weddings and funerals that are not Catholic? The answer is no. That's in that article too by Craig Allen, Worship with Non-Catholics. Do we avoid them too? The answer is yes, you do. In fact, my mother was unable to go to her grandfather, her grandfather's funeral because he was non-Catholic. The church was serious about this in the past. Okay, this one's pretty obvious. Is it a sin to attend a wedding of two gay men? Of course. Okay. My son is a confirmed Catholic, is marrying a non-Catholic but not in the church. Can I attend the wedding? The answer is no, because technically speaking, it's a sacrilege. The church teaches that for a Catholic to attempt marriage without what they call proper form, which basically means either the presence of the priest or someone that the church delegates, that in point of fact it's an invalid marriage. So basically what you're doing is you're witnessing them making vows to God, which are sacrilegious because they're not legitimately married. And so the church has said no to that. Now, I realize you can go to any priest and get 5 different answers. I'm just telling you what the church has always taught. So how do you reconcile ecumenism with us not being able to attend church services? So this is an interesting question. In 1939, Pius XII was asked by a group of theologians if they could attend the ecumenical meeting of the churches at the time. I can't remember what, like the World Council of Churches or something like that. We're going to have an ecumenical meeting. And he said, you can attend the meeting, but you are absolutely forbidden to have communicatio in sacris with them, which is another way of saying you can't pray with them. It was only after that that it collapsed. So how did it collapse? This is something that is extraordinarily subtle, but this is what happened. The church's consistent teaching up until, in fact, there is not a solid saint, theologian, or author, or pope, or anybody prior to 1939 that ever said you could pray with non-Catholics. Not one. Right? In fact, they all said it was morally sinful. As I mentioned, it was part of divine positive law and natural law. After 1939, so they hold the line. Pius XII holds the line. But then what happens is something very subtle happens. There's a lot of theologians that wanted to be able to pray with non-Catholics. And so there was a very subtle thing that they did. At the First Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council defines that the principle of unity in the Catholic Church, the principle, you cannot be considered a Catholic without being in union with the Pope. That's what they said. So the principle of unity is the papacy. Well, that's true, obviously, because it's defined. But the thing is that the church also talks about how there are other principles of unity, but they all have to submit to that principle of unity. So you can have other principles of unity, like we have one faith, one baptism, in other words, one set of sacraments. We have, but the one government is the key, and that government is in relationship to the Pope. So if you're not under the Pope, you're not in the church. It's that simple, right? Okay. So but there are other ones. So part of that, the same sacraments is actually the sacrament of holy orders, right? And the Orthodox and some of the high Anglicans, not all of them, but some of the high Anglicans actually have valid orders. So what they did, there was a very subtle shift that happened at Vatican II, which resulted in a lot of an error, and it was an ecclesiological error. What they did is they shifted the principle of unity. So first, let's back up. In the early 1800s, the Protestants came up with this idea called the branch theory. And basically what it was is that there was this one Church of Christ of which there were various branches. And so it's Catholic and Orthodox. And they're all part of this one church. And the reason they came up with that theory is they didn't like the fact that the Catholics were saying that there's only one holy Catholic and apostolic church, and that apostolic means you have to be in union with Pope, and if you're not part of the church that Christ established. End of discussion. By the way, that is what the church has always taught. Okay. Now, that being the case, so what happens is some of these theologians start subscribing to the branch theory because they want to be able to pray to these people. So what does that mean? It means, so this subtle shift now is that if you have valid orders, you're part of the church that Christ established, which was a subtle introduction of the branch theory into the Second Vatican Council, which, by the way, was actually condemned by one of the popes prior to the council, this theory. So now if you have valid orders, you can actually, that means that they're part of the Church of Christ, and that means you can pray with them. Right? That's why you can pray with the Orthodox, they say, and you can pray with it. But this is completely contrary to the ecclesiology that was in place prior to Vatican II. The entire history of the church, not just after, right? And so that's where that subtle shift came from, where you could start praying with non-Catholics. And it all happened after that. And so it's something in which the documents are going to have to get cleaned up because there's a lack of precision. It's true that holy orders are a principle of unity, but they're not the principle of unity. If the Orthodox are not in union with the Pope, even if they have this other one, they're still not part of the church that Christ established. Here's another interesting little side note. I do talk about that shift in my book, The Principle of the Integral Good. It's one of those things where I talk about it because the Catholic Church is the only religion that is integrally good. So the rest have good things about them, but they're not integrally good. Boy, lots of questions about praying with heretics. Okay. People are, what about my job? Sorry, going to have to figure some way to get around it. It's difficult, I admit. The sad part about it is, in the past, the Protestants had enough brains to know they weren't supposed to be doing this. But apparently, not even they have the brains to do it. Okay. How many of us men would it take to obviate the chastisement by turning away from evil ways? God only wanted like 10 people in Sodom and Gomorrah, but that didn't happen. I think it'd have to be a significant number. Although, we do see, one of the things I got to give the SSPX credit for is that they actually understand that prayer can influence things. So they would do like these million rosary drives, right? And get people. I think if we started doing stuff like that, you would see stuff start to shift a little bit. Is it sinful to take psychotropic medication like Prozac without grave cause or at all? Well, first of all, my first recommendation is that you read a book called The Chemical Myth. Because in that book, it's a technical book, it's difficult, it's not easy to read. But there's also there's a two-part series that was done by an investigative reporter, and what he showed was that in the 1980s, they had already discovered by the mid-1980s that none of the psychotropic drugs were producing the effect that they wanted. This was the pharmaceutical company's conclusion. But it's $1 billion industry. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that some of these don't produce some effects in some people. It just means that it's not doing what they thought it was going to do. In fact, it's actually causing more problems. I don't want to get into all the physiology of it. But the point being is that I usually tell people, well, look, I'm not so sure that this stuff is necessarily going to help you. I tend to subscribe to in Poland, they have a very specific approach because these drugs can sometimes have a temporary effect. So what they'll do is they'll bring people in that are manic, they're like literally out of their minds and uncontrollable, and they'll give them these drugs to calm them down, but then once they calm them down, they take them back off, they wean them off very quickly, and they say you don't want to go more than 3 weeks because then once that happens, your brain starts to develop receptors for the dopamine uptake, and then once that happens, when they get off, they're just a mess. Okay, so that being the case, then they just get them on to get them off. I think something like that is good. I also tell people, though, if you're on it, don't just pull the plug on it because you're going to end up in the hospital over it. You have to be weaned off of these things because of the nature of how they affect the brain. So is it sinful to take them? I think if there is a proportionate cause, and I think under most circumstances that would be grave, but I'm also open to the possibility of there being other circumstances that they might be justified. I just haven't had a chance to kind of work that side of things out. I have talked to a number of psychiatrists that work in that area, and it's kind of interesting because even they're starting to realize this stuff isn't working, or it just makes the situation worse. So here's another one. I'm not going to answer that because that is a whole... Okay, because people are asked, what if they suppress the traditional Latin Mass? Read my forthcoming book on the limits of papal authority. Okay. I'm just trying to drum up business. Okay. Why the language of Latin? Is understanding what the priest is saying at Mass important? Yes, generically, not necessarily in each individual word. You should try and understand what's going on and what he's saying. A lot of times they used to say, oh, well, it was in Latin and nobody knew what was going on. That's actually not true. People before the Second Vatican Council, generally, because of their catechetics, actually understood the Mass better than most Catholics. Today, most Catholics don't have a clue what's going on. So there's that. But why Latin? It's because of the fact that according to the Fathers, God moved Pilate, because God can control these things, determined that the three languages that would be affixed to the instrument of our salvation, the cross, were Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and that's why they're sacred, not because they appear in Scripture, by the way. but because they're affixed to the instrument of our salvation. And those particular languages do have a boosted effect in relationship to demons most of the time, because they see the sacrality of it. And it's not just the language, it's even the ecclesiastical pronunciation, even though we know that certain aspects of the ecclesiastical pronunciation are probably not like it was originally. Nevertheless, they consider even the pronunciation sacred. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti super vos et manet semper.